Hi everyone, I want to tell you a strange story that happened in America nearly 2 decades ago. Hello everyone, before diving into the heart of this mysterious tale, let me set the scene for you in as much detail as possible. Imagine this, nearly 2 decades ago, in a land where so many stories converge, the United States of America, a truly baffling incident occurred, one that has haunted both the minds of investigators and the hearts of ordinary people ever since. Have you ever lost something in your room, in the safest and most familiar of places, and no matter how sure you were it was right in front of you, you simply couldn't find it? That maddening sense of confusion and helplessness is just a small taste of what an entire city felt when confronted with the disappearance at the center of this story. The ordinary, everyday environment suddenly became the backdrop for an extraordinary event that defied logic, routine, and even the reach of relentless surveillance systems. Now, let's rewind the clock to the early 2000s, a time before smartphones were glued to every hand and before social media could instantly spread news across the nation. Daily life in America pulsed with a certain energy, colleges buzzing with students finishing exams, families gathering in restaurants, city lights glowing into the early hours, and the hum of anticipation for spring break among young people everywhere. In a city that could have been mistaken for countless others in the Midwest, something happened that would soon make headlines across the country. This isn't just the recounting of a lost item. It's the unraveling of a narrative that nobody saw coming. A tale in which a bright, ambitious medical student walks into the night, out from under the watchful eyes of his friends and security cameras alike, only to vanish without a trace. It's the kind of story that, years later, still prompts people to scratch their heads, exchange theories, and feel a cold shiver down their spines whenever the name of the missing person is mentioned. So let me share with you every twist, every detail, every piece of the puzzle from the very beginning, as we trace the steps and the mystery that has never been solved. Our story begins in Columbus. Our story begins in the heartland of America, Columbus, Ohio. As the capital and largest city of the state, Columbus is a vibrant crossroads where the classic charm of the Midwest blends with all the pulse of modern urban life. Back in the mid-2000s, the city was a tapestry of youthful ambition, busy streets lined with brick buildings and echoes of laughter from cafes and college campuses. At that time, over 900,000 people called Columbus home. Many were students at Ohio State University, which gave the city an academic pulse and diversity few other places in Ohio could match. Each spring, the city seemed to shake off the icy grip of winter and come alive with new hope and energy as students spilled into streets and parks to bask in sunshine and freedom between semesters. Downtown Columbus was a mosaic of bustling office workers, street musicians, food carts wafting the smell of hot dogs and pretzels, and families wandering through the sprawling malls. The city's skyline wasn't as iconic as, say, New York's or Chicago's, but there was something comforting about those mirrored office towers and the landmark Levesque Tower gazing over the Scioto River. Beyond the glass and steel, though, Columbus was, and is, a place with deep roots, a city where local diners recognize your face, where neighbors wave from their porches, and where everyone's a Buckeye at heart. It was into this setting that our main character, a 27-year-old medical student named Brian Shafer, stepped. Brian lived only a short walk from the buzz of downtown, surrounded by the routines of American student life, late-night study sessions, friendly debates at coffee shops tucked into bookshops, and unwinding from long hours in the library at the city's beloved bars. He was known not just for his academic dedication but his easy smile and friendly banter wherever he went. Columbus, with all its quirks and idiosyncrasies, offered Brian both the comfort of a close-knit community and the excitement of possibilities just around each corner. To truly understand what happened on that fateful spring night, it's essential to first picture the world in which it unfolded, a lively, welcoming Midwestern metropolis that seemed as safe and ordinary as anywhere else in America. And yet, within its bustling streets, something inexplicable was about to take place, one of those rare, dark mysteries that can haunt a city for generations. March 31st, 2006, March 31st, 2006 dawned with all the promise of a typical Midwestern spring day, and yet, for those involved in our story, it would become a date forever etched in memory. In Columbus, Ohio, the air was brisk but gentle, the last hints of winter lingering in shaded corners, while warm shafts of sunlight danced across budding trees and transformed busy streets into rivers of golden light. For students at Ohio State University, including Brian, it was a day that brimmed with anticipation. Their finals had recently concluded, and the excitement of spring break was almost tangible. That morning, the campus bustled not only with the relief of finished exams but also with whispers of plans. Some talked about escaping to Florida's beaches, others looked forward to home-cooked meals back with family, or just sleeping in without the specter of 8 a.m. classes hanging over them. Brian woke up in his modest off-campus apartment, sunlight slicing into the small, neat room he shared with familiar textbooks and half-packed clothes for his planned Miami getaway. Today was Friday, the capstone to an exhausting week, and already he felt lighter knowing the evening would be spent unwinding with those closest to him. As the day ticked by, Brian kept up with old routines. A casual breakfast, responding to congratulatory messages from friends, a phone call with his younger brother who was excited to hear about Miami. In the afternoon, Brian met up with his dad, Randy, for dinner. The two settled into a familiar booth at their favorite local steakhouse, the kind of place with creased menus, seasoned waitresses and steaks that sizzled as they hit the table. The father-son bond was strong. Laughter and pride colored their conversation as they discussed the future. Brian's aspirations in medicine, stories from childhood, small worries about the next chapter, but beneath the mundane details, something special hung in the air. A sense of calm and contentedness that both men might later reflect was rare and precious. Over dinner, Brian mentioned his plans to meet up with friends later that evening, his voice animated and enthusiastic. Randy, proud of the man his son had become, encouraged him to relax and celebrate. He deserved it. For Brian, the night ahead was not about blowing off steam recklessly, but about marking the start of something new. Freedom, possibility, and the closing of one chapter before opening another. As dusk fell over Columbus, city lights flickered to life and a gentle excitement swept through streets peppered with the laughter of college students. Brian headed off into the night, unaware that every moment from here on would be dissected by investigators and loved ones for years to come. March 31, 2006 wasn't just another Friday, it was the prologue to a mystery that would linger in those same spring breezes for decades. After dinner, Brian went to meet Clint, his college roommate. After finishing his dinner with his father, Brian felt a mixture of relief, excitement, and that buzzy anticipation that comes only after acing a grueling stretch of exams. He parted ways with his dad outside the steakhouse, promising to check in soon, and then walked briskly across a city glowing with early spring energy. Columbus at night teemed with life, headlights gliding down wide streets, laughter spilling out of cafes and bars, the buzz of students savoring precious freedom. For Brian, the evening was just getting started. The real celebration with his longtime friend and former college roommate Clint was next up. Clint and Brian's friendship had been forged back in the relentless days of undergraduate life, built on countless study sessions, ramen noodle dinners, tales swapped over all-nighters, and an easy camaraderie that survived both serious relationships and youthful blunders. Even as their adult lives became busier, there was a loyalty between them. An unspoken rule that whenever there was something to celebrate or a tough patch to weather, they'd make time for each other. That night was one of those sparkling moments when routines peeled away, and they could just revel in being young, hopeful, and in the thick of a city that seemed wide open to adventure. Their destination was the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a quirky but wildly popular bar perched on the second floor of a shopping plaza right off campus. The place was legendary among Ohio State students, known for loud music, neon signage, and a sprawling dance floor that pulsed whenever finals ended or football season peaked. The bar was already overflowing by the time the pair arrived, groups of friends squeezed into booths, clusters of revelers gathered around the balcony with drinks in hand, bass-heavy music thumping through the floor. It was the sort of scene where, even if you started out feeling reserved, the contagious energy pulled you in by force. Brian and Clint worked their way through the crowd, exchanging high fives with acquaintances, laughing at inside jokes, and grabbing drinks from the bustling bar. Theirs was a ritual of sorts: order their favorite beers, find a spot with a decent view of the dance floor, and dance badly, knowing nobody really cared. For a while, the stress and expectations of medical school dissolved into the background. Brian, who was usually so focused and disciplined, let himself unwind, a grin never far from his lips, his eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. Conversations with Clint bounced from reminiscing about dorm room pranks to sharing plans for the future, with plenty of good-natured ribbing in between. There was something magical in moments like these. The clatter of glasses, the hum of a favorite song, even the sticky bar floor beneath their sneakers, it all contributed to the illusion of invincibility only young adults can possess. In the midst of the ruckus, Brian texted Alexis, his girlfriend, and tried to snap a picture with Clint, the two of them goofing off, arms slung around one another, flash reflecting off beer mugs. Time felt slow and full, the prospect of Miami in a few days, the security of loyal friendships, the thrill of living in the heart of one of America's great college towns. Looking back, the signs of what was to come were invisible. To anyone watching, this was just another Friday night at OSU, one destined to blend together with dozens of other loud, exuberant celebrations. But for Brian and Clint, that night would come to pierce through the noise of memory and linger for years in the minds of everyone who cared about them. For the moment, though, everything was laughter, music, and the boundless promise of spring in Columbus. Around 10 p.m., Brian called his girlfriend Alexis. Around 10 p.m., Brian pulled out his cell phone, thumbed through his contacts, and called Alexis, his girlfriend of nearly a year. Alexis was a fellow medical student at Ohio State University, navigating the same high-stress exams and relentless schedules. They had built their relationship on countless late-night coffees, shared textbooks, and whispered encouragements across library tables. If there was anyone who truly understood Brian's world, it was Alexis. Despite the noise of the bustling bar, Brian found a quieter corner near the window, looking out over the twinkling city lights of Columbus. He pressed the phone to his ear, and after a few rings, Alexis answered, her voice warm and familiar. Their conversation slipped easily into place, comfortable and affectionate. They talked about Brian's day, how he'd finally finished his grueling exams, how he was unwinding with Clint after dinner with his father, how relieved he felt now that the weight of the semester was behind him. Alexis laughed at Brian's tired jokes, teasing him gently about his ritual celebration beers. She mentioned her own plans for the night, likely a low-key evening of studying and catching up on sleep, but her excitement for the week ahead was palpable. The couple was looking forward to a well-deserved spring break, and Brian had been the one to suggest something special, a getaway to Miami. They'd spent weeks planning, researching flights, making reservations for a cozy Airbnb near the beach, saving up just enough for a few indulgences and adventures. For both, it would be a much-needed escape, a sun-soaked departure from their frantic academic lives, and the Ohio chill that still lingered in early spring. In their call, they reviewed the final logistics, double-checking departure times and what they'd each pack. Alexis, as always, worried about forgetting something essential, her favorite sunglasses, or the worn-out paperback Brian had promised to read together under a palm tree. Throughout the call, Brian's tone was relaxed, affectionate, and full of that particular energy that comes only when you're on the brink of something exciting. "Just 2 more days," he said, more than once. For a moment, Alexis noted to herself how happy he sounded, almost lighter than he'd been in weeks, boosted by both relief and anticipation. He spoke about the little things he was looking forward to, seeing the ocean again, grabbing Cuban sandwiches, maybe even learning how to surf if Alexis was feeling brave enough to try. They shared in-jokes about Brian's questionable sunblock habits, Alexis's tendency to overschedule itineraries, and the inevitable chaos of navigating airport security together. It was a comforting, grounding exchange, the kind of private, everyday dialogue no one outside a relationship ever hears. Brian made sure to ask about Alexis's family as well, expressing his gratitude that she had always supported him during a rough stretch these past few months. The recent loss of his mother still weighed heavily, and Alexis's empathy and patience had been invaluable. But tonight, he seemed buoyed by the excitement of the near future, their Miami trip serving as both a distraction from his grief and a celebration of their resilience. They used the phone call to double-check their plans, the early morning alarm for their flight, what movies Alexis had downloaded, and even snacks she'd packed. Brian promised he'd finally try the pineapple gummies Alexis swore by, and Alexis reminded him, half stern, half giggling, not to forget his allergy medication. She urged him to get some rest after his night out, not wanting him to be exhausted or hungover on their big travel day. The couple's banter shifted from joking to sentimental. Brian told Alexis how much he loved her, remarking that he couldn't imagine a better spring break companion. This conversation was ordinary in the most extraordinary, comforting way. There was no hint of tension, no argument or oddness, just the anticipation of reuniting after the long, hard semester. Their rituals played out. Alexis told Brian to text her when he got home safely, and Brian, smiling at her protectiveness, promised he would. They exchanged teasing words, Loving reminders, even a few whispered confessions of missing each other, despite knowing they'd see one another soon. If someone could have listened in, they would have heard nothing amiss, nothing to foreshadow the strangeness that was about to descend on both their lives. Instead, this call captured two young people at a crossroads, full of hope, dreaming of sand and waves, believing the world was theirs for the taking. When Brian finally hung up, Alexis sat for a moment, phone in hand, smiling quietly as she pictured their imminent adventure. She had no way of knowing it would be the last time she'd ever hear his voice. Meanwhile, Brian stood by the window for a moment after they disconnected. The sound of Alexis's voice lingered in his mind, soothing and steadying him. In that instant, despite the laughter swirling around the bar, despite the collective thrill of students celebrating the end of finals, Brian felt anchored, grounded by the intimacy of a call with someone who truly mattered. He pocketed his phone, a small smile lingering on his lips, and rejoined Clint, who was waiting with another round of drinks. The world outside seemed bright with possibility, crackling with the promise of a new chapter about to begin. From Alexis's perspective, she went about her night as usual, reassured by the normalcy of their conversation. She texted Brian a goodnight message just before sleep, expecting to see him in person soon. At that moment, nothing seemed out of order, no cause for worry at all. It would only be in the haunting aftermath, in the days and weeks of aching uncertainty, that Alexis would replay every snippet of that call, searching for clues or hidden meanings that simply weren't there. For both Brian and Alexis, that 10 p.m. phone call was a snapshot of young love, secure, vibrant, and blissfully unaware of the darkness on the horizon. In the years to come, it would be replayed in memory like an old home movie, Alexis's gentle laughter, Brian's assured promises, the two of them making plans and imagining a future together. It was the kind of conversation that anchors a life, the sort you never think will become a last goodbye. Yet fate, unknown to both of them, was already drifting near. In this quiet, precious moment, their hopefulness stood in stark, poignant contrast to the mystery about to unfold. After the call. After Brian ended his call with Alexis, he slid his phone back into his pocket, popping a quiet smile that lingered for a heartbeat. The sounds of the bar, with its pulsating music and waves of laughter, felt both grounding and abstract, like the world outside had faded away just for a moment. He felt lighter, relieved after days of relentless studying, comforted by Alexis's steady excitement, and buoyed by the anticipation of a vacation that now felt so close he could taste the salty Miami air. Clint leaned over from their table, raising a brow and grinning. "Good news? Did she say yes to letting you pack your swim trunks this time?" The inside joke bounced easily between them, and Brian let out a genuine laugh. It was that kind of night. Old friends picking up where they'd left off, the stresses of med school and recent grief held at bay by the simple warmth of camaraderie. The bar they found themselves in was one of those hallowed OSU hangouts. Dim lights, threadbare booths patched with duct tape, walls littered with band posters and faded bar flyers. Each table buzzed with its own universe of conversation. Undergrads celebrating the last final of the semester, couples tracing plans for upcoming trips, regulars quietly nursing their pint glasses. For Brian and Clint, this space was a familiar comfort, a world where nothing bad could follow them in from the outside. It was edging toward midnight when Meredith, an acquaintance from the university, texted Clint asking what their plans were. Without much hesitation, they invited her to join their bar-hopping adventure. A few minutes later she arrived, shaking off the night's chill, instantly absorbed into the friendly fold. With the trio formed, the night seemed to pick up its own momentum, rolling forward on a current of shared stories and spontaneous decisions. They paid their tab and threaded their way out into the cool air, energy pulsing in their strides as they made the short walk to a nearby club, one louder, sharper, and packed shoulder to shoulder with revelers. The air outside felt brisk and electric, the lights of High Street cutting golden ribbons through the dark. Brian tilted his face upward for a moment, breathing deep, feeling the city thrum beneath his feet. Inside the next venue, the thump of bass pressed on their chests. Lights spun across the room, illuminating the swirl of faces. Everyone caught up in the unspoken agreement that tonight was a celebration, a break before reality inevitably returned. Brian ordered another beer, clinking bottles with Clint and Meredith, and let himself dissolve into the crowd. Here, he was simply a young man among friends, not the son still aching from loss, not the student perpetually weighted by grades and the future. They reminisced about dorm life, about overcooked ramen, about the time Clint accidentally set off a residence hall alarm with microwaved popcorn. They swapped stories about professors, about classes they'd survived and the ones that had nearly broken them. Every laughter rang out a little brighter, every anecdote colored a little bolder under the glow of neon and the haze of nostalgia. Yet, beneath the revelry, Brian couldn't help but feel a subtle thread of bitter sweetness. He missed his mother terribly, an ache that seemed to flare up at the most unexpected moments. Alexis's words still echoed in his mind, reassurances, reminders to be gentle with himself, encouragement to find joy. Tonight, surrounded by friends and strangers alike, he let himself feel alive, a rare, unfiltered happiness laced with hope, wistfulness, and a measure of relief. After an hour or so in the club, after dancing badly to an old pop song, after oversharing embarrassing med school tales, they decided to circle back to the first bar, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. They joked about making a full lap of High Street, taking selfies in front of graffiti, pausing to buy soft pretzels from a street vendor who, by midnight, had become as much a part of the scenery as the bars themselves. There was a kinetic freedom to it, a sense that they could write the night however they chose. Re-entering the Ugly Tuna, it felt like no time had passed at all. The scene inside was barely controlled chaos, students pressed against the balcony railing, a cover band yowling out early 2000s hits, friends greeting each other like soldiers returning from war. Brian and his friends squeezed their way through, finally finding a patch of space by the wall where they could deposit half-finished drinks and regroup. Brian pulled out his phone, briefly checking to see if Alexis had replied. A short, playful message from her popped up, a string of emojis, and, "Don't stay out too late, I know you!" He grinned, feeling the world narrow to that small, perfect moment. From an outsider's view, there was little to distinguish Brian from the hundreds of other young people out that night. He laughed, he danced, he made promises to text when he got home, he teased Meredith about her taste in cocktails, he poked fun at Clint's nostalgia. The sense of safety inside the bubble of friendship was all-encompassing. It seemed impossible that anything could go wrong, that tomorrow could bring anything but more stories like these. As the clock ticked well past midnight, the trio's conversations turned more reflective. Meredith, newer to the group but instantly welcomed, asked probing questions about life after school, about family, about what everyone wanted most after graduation. Brian spoke honestly in a way he'd reserved only for the closest friends, how medicine felt like a calling and a burden in equal measure, how his mother's passing rearranged his definitions of success and meaning. Clint offered his own tales, sometimes self-deprecating, other times unexpectedly wise. They made a pact, in the way only tipsy students can, to keep in touch no matter how far life pulled them from Columbus. Numbers were written on napkins already stained with condensation, arms thrown over shoulders in impromptu group hugs, promises made with laughter and the faintest shimmer of real sincerity underneath it all. Eventually, they talked their way onto the balcony, where the city spread out in soft orange and violet hues, a perfect counterpoint to the indoor cacophony. Brian took in the view, the familiar curve of the skyline, the ribbon of glowing streetlights snaking between buildings, the distant, beckoning promise of something more. With the bass vibrations at his back and the night's cool breeze on his face, he let himself hope, about new beginnings, about healing, about the little things that made life worth all its trouble. And even as the next mysteries of fate hovered, still out of sight, Brian's world that night was wrapped in friendship, promise, and the unspoken belief that tomorrow would simply bring new adventures. 1:15 a.m., the security cameras blinked to life, their grainy lenses capturing fleeting snapshots of the night's waning energy. Down in the heart of the shopping plaza, the automatic glass doors slid open, and Brian, Clint, and Meredith stepped out of the chilly Columbus night and into the artificial brightness of the entrance atrium. Exhaustion mingled with that peculiar looseness that only comes after hours of laughter, beer, and reminiscing. Their steps echoed across the tiled floor as they joked about the neon-lit chaos of High Street. Brian, his hair slightly rumpled and shirt untucked, looked both easygoing and tired, a young man burning through the final embers of celebration. Ascending the escalator, the trio observed their own reflections gliding upward in the mirrored paneling. Clint nudged Meredith, making a face at their stretched, ghostly doppelgangers. Meredith rolled her eyes, but her grin said she appreciated the humor. The building, mostly quiet now save for the pockets of college students still wandering in and out of the bars, felt strangely timeless, as if the night was hanging just a little too long, grudgingly giving way to morning. When they reached the second-floor landing, the group hesitated for a moment under the fluorescent glow of the main corridor. The ugly Tuna Saloona loomed just ahead with its gaudy, pulsing signage, doors propped open to let out thumping music and the smell of stale draft beer. Clint pulled out his phone, checking the time with a mock groan at how late they'd stayed out. Meredith teased him, saying that if he wanted to be back by morning, he shouldn't have bought that round of tequila shots earlier. Brian checked his own phone too, replying to a trivial text from Alexis, a smile lingering on his face from some inside joke only the two of them would understand. Inside the bar, a few clusters of stubborn revelers were still crowded around small tables or gyrating lazily on the dance floor, unwilling to call it quits even as last call approached. The lights had altered just slightly, brighter now, less forgiving, washing over faces splotched by tiredness or liquor. Brian and Meredith made their way inside together, Clint trailing at their heels. The bouncers nodded them through without much enthusiasm, eyes already trained on the clock. Once inside, the dynamic of the group subtly shifted. The noisy close quarters of the bar pressed them together, but with a hint of reluctance, like old friends not quite wanting the night to end yet aware that it must soon. Brian leaned against the railing that overlooked High Street, peering down at the sporadic streaks of headlights and the occasional laughter of late-night passers-by. Meredith, casually cradling a cheap beer, started recounting a story from their university days. A small, awkward incident involving a biology professor and a spilled tray of frogs. The tale was familiar, nostalgia-tinged, and it made Clint throw his head back in a fit of laughter that radiated through their small circle. Between snatches of conversation and half-distracted glances at their watches, the group's focus drifted. Brian, usually attentive, seemed now both present and lost in his own labyrinth of thoughts, maybe reflecting on the Miami trip, maybe remembering his mom, or perhaps just savoring the rare sense of lightness that comes so infrequently in adult life. When Meredith excused herself to the restroom, Brian and Clint exchanged a quiet look that spoke to years of friendship, a comfortable silence, neither awkward nor forced. The digital clock behind the bar crept closer to closing time, and with every sip, the energy of the place faded to something soft and muted. Staff began to stack chairs and mop up puddles of spilled drink. The DJ, now just a sleepy figure hunched over his laptop, let the music trickle down to an easy, slow rhythm. Faintly, the security cameras recorded it all, the gentle swaying, the quick hugs, whispered goodbyes, and the way each person's shadow seemed oddly elongated in the harsh overhead lights. Meredith soon returned from the restroom, waving her phone apologetically. She had a rideshare waiting outside, and despite the lingering reluctance, she knew it was time to head home. The three clustered by the doorway, exchanging another round of half-joking promises to keep in touch. Meredith reached up to give Clint a brisk, fond hug, then squeezed Brian's hand a little longer than strictly necessary. She told him to get some sleep and not to miss his flight to Miami, a reminder packed with both humor and genuine concern. Then with a final wave she melted into the hallway, her exit swallowed by the buzz of the closing bar. Left alone together, Brian and Clint found themselves standing near the entrance watching the small crowd diminish with each passing minute. Brian suggested stepping outside for some air, his tone casual but his face closed off in a way that suggested he was seeking a moment of space amid the noise. Clint, feeling the fatigue of the night, decided to stay behind and settle their tab, nodding as Brian slipped out the front door. All of this, the winding down of the night, the shuffling of bar staff, the string of goodbyes, was immortalized in the silent vigilance of the security cameras. From the outside, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just a group of friends calling it a night, an unremarkable snapshot in the endless reel of college memories. But for those who would later dissect every second of footage, it was the last sliver of certainty in the mysterious timeline of Brian Shafer's disappearance. 1:55 a.m. marked the final moment the security camera would ever capture Brian's presence, a timestamp that later investigators and family would treat like a crack in history's glass. In the dim glow of the club's interior, awash in the artificial light that gave everyone a washed-out, dreamlike pallor, Brian became a fleeting image, moving, living, real, and then, suddenly, gone. The movement of bodies in the frame, the sideways glance of a bartender, the metallic glint of a bar stool, all captured in those last routine seconds before the unthinkable occurred. Time seemed to pause, recording Brian as he exchanged departing words with friends, his features open and relaxed, seemingly unaware of the significance those seconds would take on in the years to come. For law enforcement, and those who would later comb through the camera footage, every frame carried unbearable importance. There was Brian walking past the neon-lit door, his posture loose but purposeful, a glimmer of fatigue around his eyes, his clothing slightly rumpled from hours of celebration and movement. The bar, now near closing, was emptying out, the staff beginning the ritual of readying for a new day, straightening chairs, mopping floors, checking the final till. The world outside lingered in foggy spring darkness, city lights blurring into an indistinct swirl in the background of every window. On film, Brian did not appear distressed or hurried. He offered a handshake to a departing acquaintance, nodded politely at a passing employee, and slipped his phone into his pocket with a familiar, practiced motion. What is haunting in retrospect is the utter normalcy of it all, the casual gestures, the measured pace, the small smiles exchanged as though nothing unusual was about to happen. Nothing in Brian's body language suggested worry, fear, or premonition. To those watching, he could have been any young man on any night, finishing just another chapter in a life full of such scenes. As the time ticked toward 2 a.m., the video became a silent record of transition, from movement to stillness, activity to aftermath. The last frame with Brian in it is not especially dramatic. He is passing through the threshold of the bar toward the area that led to the back, stepping just out of sight of the camera's lens. The lights overhead flickered, someone in the corner laughed, and then, as if by some trick, Brian was simply not there. One moment he existed in a world of noise and company, the next he was a ghost in the data, his presence lost to a dead zone just off camera. Somewhere the echo of the closing song drifted through the speakers, and Brian's absence was not immediately noticed. As the clock inched past closing, Clint and a handful of other lingerers shuffled toward the exit, meeting up in the foyer to confirm plans or call rides. Someone behind the bar called out a reminder to grab your jacket, and the cleaning staff swept up the last drops of spilled beer. In the confusion and routine of those final minutes, there was nothing to mark the gravity of what had just happened. Later, as the footage was studied by police and desperate family members, the sinking sense of dread grew. How could a person simply step out of view and vanish completely? Investigators slowed down the footage, reversed it, analyzed it frame by frame. They traced possible pathways Brian might have taken off camera. Was there another exit, maybe a poorly lit corridor or an overlooked staircase? Yet no further visual confirmation of Brian appeared. No silhouette, no reflection, nothing. It was as if, in those seconds, the world folded over him and left only questions in its wake. The camera's footage became its own sort of ruination, a trapdoor in time. Family and friends would revisit that video, staring at Brian's final moments, searching for a clue, a gesture, any sign at all. Some would watch it so many times that they memorized each object in the frame, scrutinized every background face, and even mapped out the shifting body language of the other guests. Still, nobody ever found the answer to the simplest question: where did Brian go? His image, trapped forever in pixelated grayscale, became both a symbol of endurance and a source of heartbreak. As the last patrons stumbled into the muted streets, their footsteps faded and the hum of the city returned to its ordinary pulse. The clock struck 2 a.m. and the staff closed the doors, all traces of the night's celebration swept away, except for the unresolved absence of one man. In the memory of the ugly tuna saloona, Brian's exit became legendary, and his story, frozen on security tape, would haunt Columbus, his family, and anyone who ever learned his name. The next morning arrived with a quiet, tentative light that crept through Alexis's apartment window, casting soft gold and gray shadows over her unmade bed and restless form. Most people, in those calm hours just past sunrise, savor the relief of a weekend and the promise of spring break. For Alexis, it should have been a day full of eager anticipation, a countdown really to when she would see Brian, her boyfriend, in person, bags packed and tickets ready for Miami. Instead, an inexplicable unease hovered just at the edge of her awareness, nudging her from dreams into the jarring clarity of morning. She rolled over and checked her phone instinctively. Night messages from her study group blinked unread, and among them was the quick, playful text Brian had sent just after midnight, a string of emojis, a half-joking promise to be home soon, and that little heart he sometimes added. She smiled at the memory but was surprised to see that he hadn't replied to her final message from hours before. Alexis tried not to read into it. After all, Brian was out celebrating, probably crashed at home, phone battery dead, or caught up in the inertia of a good night out. Still, a thought nagged at the back of her mind. He always texted her before sleeping, almost like a ritual. especially after a night out. It was an unspoken rule, a quiet reassurance that the world still spun as it should. Shrugging off the anxiety as mere overthinking, she brushed her hair, made coffee, and started her usual morning routine. But as the minutes slipped by, her concern grew like a shadow stretching with the day. She tried calling Brian's phone, expecting it to go straight to voicemail, but instead it rang endlessly, unanswered. Alexis listened to the slow, repetitive drone, a sound that, by the fifth ring, felt unsettlingly foreign. Finally, his voicemail cut in, Brian's recorded voice, warm and familiar, urging callers to leave a message and I'll get back to you. Alexis left a light-hearted note. Hey, sleepyhead, rise and shine, don't forget our flight. She hung up, squeezed her coffee mug and tried to focus on packing. But 20 minutes later, unable to shake the rising tide of apprehension, she tried again. The same result. Ringing, voicemail. A third time, an hour afterward, she left a more serious message, her forced cheer giving way to a subtle edge of worry. Brian, are you okay? Please text me when you wake up. By midday, Alexis's concern turned into a gnawing dread. She texted Clint, hoping he'd say Brian just crashed at his place or left his phone somewhere. Clint's response was vague and unhelpful. He thought Brian had headed home, was fine the last time he saw him. The puzzle pieces didn't align. Alexis called Brian's phone again, her own voice now thin and tense in the silent apartment. Again the impassive voicemail box picked up, her words tumbling out onto digital memory. Every hour that passed dialed her anxiety higher. She called Brian's father, tried to sound casual, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Hey Randy, have you heard from Brian? I haven't been able to reach him all morning. Maybe his phone's dead? Randy's reply was measured but concerned. He hadn't spoken to Brian since dinner the night before, but he would try reaching out. Alexis sat on her bed, knees hugged to her chest. She stared at her phone, letting it rest in her hands as sunlight crawled steadily across the floorboards. She refreshed messages, checked missed calls, watched the battery icon pulse downward, and then charged her phone to ensure she missed nothing. The minutes crawled. Each attempt to call Brian became its own kind of plea, raw with urgency. She replayed their last conversation in her head, searching for any sign of tension, a coded message she might have missed. Had he sounded different? Was there a hint that he was in trouble or feeling lost? Each time she remembered, it felt utterly routine, even joyful, a normalcy now warped by absence. Alexis started pacing, her mind looping through all the possible explanations. Maybe Brian lost his phone, maybe he had one too many drinks and left it at the bar, maybe he simply went to sleep. She clung to those thoughts as life rafts against an ocean of darker possibilities. As the afternoon approached, she began calling friends, one by one. Meredith had no idea. She'd already left for home. Clint's reassurance started to falter as he admitted he also hadn't heard from Brian all day. One by one, concern rippled through the group, first as confusion, then as quiet panic. By early evening, Alexis's anxiety had transformed into the sort of panic that burns slow and bright, making everything else fade away. She stopped pretending to pack. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the street for a familiar figure, the daylight now fading, her chest tight each time an unknown number tried to break her focus or the phone lit up with a notification that wasn't from Brian. She texted again, Brian, please, just let me know you're okay. The reply never came. Her fear, once an abstract shape, became an all-consuming force. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them away, not wanting to give in yet. She dialed Brian's number once more, her thumb trembling, each ring stretching time unbearably thin. When the robotic operator told her, the mailbox is full, a chill ran down her spine. As the evening edged toward nightfall, Alexis knew something was truly wrong. The world had grown both too quiet and painfully loud. The tick of a clock, the distant sounds of city life, the background hum of her own ragged breathing. She called Brian's father again, her voice now openly desperate. By the time they confirmed neither of them could reach Brian, the decisions began to crystallize. They would call the local hospitals, check with campus police, reach out to every acquaintance in town. While the city settled into another night, Alexis's world was unraveling. She sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by the trappings of normal life, a half-packed suitcase, sunscreen and swimsuits, travel-sized toothpaste, all rendered meaningless in the sudden gaping absence of the man she loved. Every echo in the apartment seemed sinister, every unanswered call, a fresh wound. Still, with hope stubbornly smoldering, she scribbled down the list of bars Brian might have visited, replayed the last voicemail he'd sent, and wrote down questions for anyone who might have seen him. Long after midnight, when sleep should have claimed her, Alexis kept reaching for her phone, redialing, praying for a change, a single ring, a returned call, a chirpy response to break the silence swallowing her hope. Instead, she was met only with her own words, captured and forgotten in the same empty mailbox. Night fell heavy and thick, and Alexis, heart frayed and mind racing, waited for news that never came. The morning sunlight hadn't even burned off the Ohio mist when Columbus police officers first received word that Brian Shafer, medical student, beloved son, loyal friend, had vanished without a trace. The initial report landed like so many others. A young man didn't come home after a night out, didn't answer phone calls, had perhaps stayed at a friend's place or kept the party going until morning. But as the hours ticked by and calls from family and friends became more urgent, a tremor of unease ran through the station. By midday, detectives were assigned to the case and began their work with a routine skepticism that slowly shifted to grave concern. Brian wasn't the sort to disappear, they noted in their files. He had no history of running off, no brushes with the law, and an imminent spring break trip he'd been eagerly anticipating. His girlfriend Alexis's voice shook as she recounted every missed call, and his father Randy's worry was plain in each terse sentence. By early afternoon, flyers with Brian's photo and description had started appearing on telephone poles near campus, but the search that Friday would become anything but routine. The first step for police was tracing Brian's last known movements. Detectives made their way to the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the bar where he was last seen, and requested all available surveillance footage. Hours of grainy video were pored over, frame by frame, each officer squinting through jittery images of students laughing, dancing, and tumbling in and out of view. Brian appeared clear as daylight, walking with friends, pausing by the entrance, stepping into the background. But then, like a vanished shade, he simply exited the frame and did not reappear. No camera, it seemed, captured him leaving the building. There was no footage of him stumbling into the street, no silhouette rounding the stairwell, no sight of him entering the construction site that loomed on the block's far side. It was as if the bubble of the bar swallowed him and refused to return any answers. With the image of Brian frozen on the screen, investigators fanned out. They canvassed the bar staff, bouncers, patrons, anyone who'd been there that night. The stories were all much the same. Brian laughed, hugged friends, talked about Miami, and gave no signs of distress. There wasn't a whiff of confrontation. Yet even as they took notes and recorded interviews, a disturbing question hung in the air. If he hadn't left through the front, how did he disappear? Was there a back exit, an overlooked passage, a hidden stairwell behind the clutter of beer crates and cleaning supplies? Police meticulously inspected the bar's layout, crawling through corridors, checking maintenance access, examining every possible path. Still, nothing emerged, no evidence he'd slipped away unseen. Attention turned to the construction site adjacent to the plaza, its tangle of scaffolding, concrete slabs, debris piles, and the ever-present hazards of an unfinished structure. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their noses combing through half-set cement and the sharp tang of rust and dust. Officers in high-visibility gear tromped through every shadow, calling Brian's name, probing for any sign he'd wandered, lost or drunk into danger. The search yielded nothing, not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, and certainly not the person everyone so desperately sought. Days bled into each other as the investigation deepened. Detectives ran background checks, combed through Brian's phone records and emails, sought out anyone he might have contacted in the hours before his disappearance. They checked hospital admittance logs, emergency shelters, and even the county morgue, each step bringing only more questions. At every dead end, families lingered at the periphery, their hope flickering with every police radio squawk and passing squad car. The case soon attracted media attention. News vans lined High Street, and reporters pounced on every new development. The public's curiosity quickly became a wave of speculation. Was it a crime? An accident? Had Brian chosen to disappear, to shed the pressures of impending adulthood and heartbreak? The Columbus police, careful and deliberate, refused to rule anything out. They organized press conferences, politely rebuffing wild rumors, pleading for information, and urging anyone with the faintest recollection to come forward. Tips trickled in. Suspicious figures lurking near the bar, a stranger allegedly seen with Brian, even the suggestion of a mysterious rideshare. But every lead quickly frayed in the harsh light of investigation. In time, detectives questioned Brian's friends and family at length. Some, like Alexis and Randy, were emotionally wrecked, their memories replaying every interaction ad nauseum. Others sat under the sterile glare of a police interview room, their answers measured, sometimes defensive. Had anyone seen Brian upset, drinking too much, pushing boundaries? No. Each insisted, if anything, Brian had been buoyed by laughter and plans, by the sense that spring was finally opening up before him. The investigation pressed on, methodical and relentless. Phone pings were mapped, campus security logs dissected, bar receipts verified, anonymous tip lines rang late into the night, each new call scrutinized for grains of truth. Columbus police worked alongside university authorities, the search expanding far beyond the plaza where Brian was last seen. In every new bit of evidence, they hoped for a break, a sighting, an overlooked text, a slip-up from a potential suspect, but each hope was dashed against the unchangeable fact. Brian Shafer remained missing, and the longer the silence stretched, the colder the trail became. Behind the scenes, officers faced the awful reality of missing persons cases, their numbers, their heartbreak, the dull ache of not knowing. Parents paced the precinct lobby all night, flyers curled in trembling hands. Friends started social media campaigns, organizing search parties, trekking into every park and alleyway in the city. Even after days turned to weeks and weeks threatened to dissolve into months, the Columbus PD refused to let the case slip into obscurity. The photo of Brian, smiling, dark-haired, eyes full of light, lingered on bulletin boards and in the minds of everyone who watched the investigation unfold. A constant reminder that somewhere, the truth was still out there, waiting to be found. In the weeks and months following Brian Shafer's baffling disappearance, the silence left behind was quickly filled by a chorus of speculation and countless theories. The city of Columbus, once united in shared confusion and anxiety, became a hub for armchair detectives, devastated family members, and insatiable media outlets, all trying to piece together an explanation for how a seemingly ordinary night could end with a man vanishing into thin air. In hushed conversations at coffee shops, tearful interviews on TV, and fevered discussions online, theories multiplied with every retelling of the details. Some had the ring of the plausible, while others delved deep into the realm of the uncanny. The police themselves were not immune to speculation either, though they tried to balance methodical procedure with the pressure of public expectations. The most immediate theory to take hold was that of accidental misfortune. This version played heavily on the idea that Brian, after a long night of drinking and celebration, might have wandered out of sight, perhaps through an unmonitored back door, or even into the dangerous construction site adjacent to the ugly Tuna Saloona. Despite exhaustive searches by officers and cadaver dogs and a close look at all possible ingress and egress points, no trace of him was ever found. The lack of physical evidence, no personal belongings left behind, no signs of injury, no body, eventually wore down the strength of this hypothesis, though it never fully disappeared from the public mind. Other explanations took on a far darker tone. Some citizens and commentators speculated about the possibility of foul play occurring either inside or around the bar. The fact that the ugly Tuna Saloona was busy with students and bar staff that night did little to dissuade theories about secret altercations, a staged disappearance, or even a clandestine exit, helped by someone with inside knowledge of the building. Whispered rumors attached themselves to everyone who had last seen Brian. Could Clint or Meredith, or even a stranger, have been involved? Was there something that the witnesses weren't saying, either out of fear or misplaced loyalty? Crime theories also spread outward, encompassing broader possibilities. Perhaps Brian had become the victim of a random act of violence, robbed and assaulted outside the bar, or caught in the crossfire of something far more sinister. Local incidents of organized crime, if not directly linked, were nonetheless invoked in retellings of his story. Did someone target Brian, a young man distracted and unsteady from a night out, for reasons police could only dimly guess at? Despite a meticulous canvass for witnesses, video footage, and forensics, nothing seemed to support the notion of robbery or confrontation, but the lack of evidence only fueled the flames. After all, what's more frightening than evil that leaves no traces at all? Some of Columbus's more inventive minds took the narrative further into the extraordinary, a disappearing act worthy of urban legend status. There were murmurs that Brian had faked his own disappearance, spurred by personal anguish, the pain of his mother's recent death, or the pressures of impending adulthood. Internet sleuths pored over his online profiles, scrutinizing his travel plans, music lyrics he liked, even grainy vacation photos, constructing a case in which Brian could have possibly started a new life somewhere else. These theories often ignored the emotional carnage left behind: a grieving girlfriend, a devastated father, half-packed bags for a spring break trip he seemed genuinely excited about. Still, the idea of Brian slipping away into anonymity, resourceful, grieving, and clever, was a powerful myth that some refused to let go of, especially after years passed with no conclusive leads. Whispers of international intrigue even surfaced from time to time. Tips sent to police and family described Brian as supposedly spotted in far-flung places, beaches in the Caribbean, bustling streets in Europe. Each was investigated, each faded under the harsh glare of truth. For some, the strangeness of the building's layout and camera coverage became a theory all its own. Could Brian have hidden somewhere in the bar, wandered into a part of the structure no one thought to search, or even suffered a medical emergency behind a locked door or in a storage room? These ideas were often fueled by the paradoxical nature of modern surveillance. It seemed impossible that, in a world bristling with cameras and connectivity, a person could simply cease to exist between two frames of recording, yet that was precisely what had happened. Others, with a more spiritual or superstitious bent, began circulating tales of curses, omens, or bad luck swirling around the spot, imbuing the city's collective anxiety with notes of urban legend. For desperate friends and family, no supposition was too wild to ignore, even the outlandish ones, as long as they brought the faintest possibility of an answer. The one theory that continued to bear down most painfully was the simplest, that someone, somewhere, knew far more than they were saying. Detective notes sometimes bristled with frustration at the gaps in interviews, at the stifling silence from certain witnesses, and at the persistent, gnawing question of whether the truth had walked past them, unseen, on that fateful night. All of these ideas coexisted, sometimes harmonizing, more often clashing, as the years ground on. Flyers and web postings kept the speculation alive, each new tip breathing a little more urgency into cold ashes. For Brian's loved ones, the parade of theories was sometimes comforting, proof that people still cared, that the world hadn't forgotten. Far more often, though, it was salt in a wound, possibilities with no resolution, each one carrying the hope of closure but rarely offering peace. To this day, the web of theories surrounding Brian Shafer represents not just the hunger for answers, but the very human need to make sense of the inexplicable. As long as the questions remain, so too will the stories, and the hope, however fragile, that one day the truth will be found. In the days and weeks following Brian's disappearance, his father Randy and younger brother Derek threw themselves into the search with a fervor that bordered on desperation. For Randy, the loss was unthinkable. A son who had always called, always come home, now simply missing without a trace. Derek, just a few years younger than Brian, found himself shouldering an impossible burden, torn between hope and a bleak reality, but refusing to give in. The two of them became a constant presence throughout Columbus, posting flyers on utility poles and bulletin boards, slipping photographs into the hands of strangers leaving campus coffee shops, and speaking with police officers at all hours. Randy's face quickly became familiar to the local media. He appeared on televised news segments, his eyes tired and voice catching as he pleaded for any information that could lead to Brian's return. Derek, more soft-spoken, channeled his energy into action. He retraced Brian's last known steps over and over, walking the route from the ugly tuna saloon to Brian's apartment, searching alleys, checking underpasses, and negotiating entry with managers of nearby shops and construction sites. Each night, they tuned into tip hotlines, hoping for a breakthrough that never arrived. Still, they couldn't stop. Not while there was the faintest possibility that Brian might still be alive, waiting in some hidden corner for rescue. They organized volunteer search parties, drawing friends and sympathetic strangers who combed through parks, old buildings, and abandoned lots. Derek, often the first to arrive and last to leave, never let exhaustion show, determined not to let his brother's story fade into the background noise of a bustling city. He created social media pages and online forums dedicated to Brian, answering every comment, responding to every rumor, updating followers on the family's efforts. He and Randy held vigils on campus, lighting candles, sharing memories, and urging the public to remember that Brian was more than just a headline. He was a beloved son and brother. Sometimes Randy would stand in silence at the vigil, scanning the faces in the crowd for any sign of recognition or hope.